All right, let's get right into it. We're going to talk about the one man who took the Roman Republic, the rising superpower of the ancient world, and brought it right to the edge of total collapse. His name was Hannibal, and for an entire generation, he was Rome's absolute worst nightmare. You know, this phrase, Hannibal is at the gates, it wasn't just a battlefield warning. It actually became a common saying in Rome, something people would shout out whenever disaster was looming. It just shows you how deep the fear of this one man was, literally burned into the Roman soul. So where does a figure like this even come from? Well, his story doesn't start with him as a general. It starts much, much earlier, with a promise made by a little boy who was born into a family that was defined by one thing: its hatred of Rome. I mean, his destiny almost seems like it was written right into his name. Hannibal means grace of Baal, a really powerful god. And his family name, Barca, that means thunderbolt. How perfect is that? It was the perfect way to describe their family's style of war: swift, sudden, and absolutely ferocious. And this is the moment that changes everything. Just picture it. You've got a 9-year-old boy, and his father, the famous general Hannibal Barca, brings him to a temple, and there, with his hand on a sacrifice, he makes his son swear an oath of eternal, undying hatred for Rome. This wasn't just some kid's promise. This was the vow that would shape his entire life. Okay, so fast forward a few years, and that oath is about to be unleashed. Hannibal is now the commander-in-chief, and he kicks off the Second Punic War with an invasion plan that wasn't just audacious, it was something that the Romans thought was completely, utterly impossible. See, everyone expected an attack by sea, but Hannibal? No way. He chose to march over land. He fought his way across Spain, he crossed the massive Pyrenees Mountains, he dodged a whole Roman army in what is now France, and then he faced the biggest obstacle of all: the Alps. We're talking a logistical nightmare and just an unbelievable feat of sheer will. And the cost of that journey was just staggering. He made it, yeah, but he arrived in Italy with just a fraction of the army he started with. Think about that. He lost almost half his men to the cold, the terrain, and constant ambushes. So his invasion of Italy began with his army already shattered. But for Hannibal, this was just the warm-up. Because once he was on Italian soil, he was just unstoppable. He scores a quick victory at Ticinus. Then he crushes a much larger Roman army at Trebia. But the real masterpiece was at Lake Trasimene. He literally hid his entire army in the fog along the hills of the lake, waited for the Roman legions to march right in, and then he sprung the trap. He completely annihilated them in one of the biggest and most successful ambushes in all of history. But believe it or not, even that incredible ambush was nothing compared to what he did next. Now we're talking about the Battle of Cannae. This is the moment that would define his legacy. This is the battle that generals would be studying for the next 2,000 years. Just look at the numbers here. Hannibal is facing a Roman army of around 80,000 soldiers, the biggest army they had ever put in the field. He's outnumbered, his infantry is weaker. I mean, on paper, this should have been a slam dunk for Rome, no question. But Hannibal had a plan, a tactic that was so brilliant in its simplicity: the double envelopment. He put his weakest soldiers right in the center and told them to slowly give ground. So the Romans, thinking they're about to break through, just surge forward right into this pocket. And that's exactly when the trap snaps shut. Hannibal's best troops, waiting on the wings, swing in from the sides, while his cavalry smashes into their rear. The entire Roman army was completely surrounded. The result was, well, it was pure carnage. More than 50,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured in a single afternoon. To give you some perspective on that, the Roman Senate lost almost a third of its members on that one day. It was an unthinkable disaster for Rome, and for Hannibal, it was his tactical masterpiece. Honestly, it was one of the bloodiest single days in the history of warfare. Right after this incredible slaughter, Hannibal's own cavalry commander, a guy named Hannibal, begged him, "March on Rome, it's defenseless." But Hannibal hesitated. He refused. And that's when Hannibal said these famous, frustrated words. And this, right here, leads to one of the biggest what-ifs in all of history. Why didn't he attack the city? Because Hannibal chose not to march on Rome, the entire war shifted. Rome was now completely terrified of his genius on the battlefield, so they totally changed their gameplay. So you end up with this incredible clash of strategies. Hannibal is desperate for another big knockout battle. That's his whole thing. But the Romans, led by a general named Fabius, adopt a new tactic that came to be known as the Fabian strategy. What is it? Simple. Don't fight Hannibal. Ever. They just shadowed his army, picked off his foraging parties, and basically just waited him out, counting on their massive reserves of manpower to slowly bleed him dry. And can you believe it? For 15 years, 15, Hannibal and his army were basically trapped in Italy. He was undefeated, sure, but he couldn't win the war. He was totally isolated. He kept asking for more men and more siege weapons from his government back in Carthage, but they basically left him hanging. He just couldn't land that final killer blow. So now we come to the final act, because eventually Rome produces a general who wasn't scared, a guy who was willing to innovate and take Hannibal on. His name was Scipio, and he would go down in history as Scipio Africanus. What Scipio did was just brilliant. Instead of fighting Hannibal in Italy, he took the war to Carthage's home turf in North Africa. Hannibal had no choice. He was recalled to defend his city. And at the Battle of Zama, the tables were finally completely turned. For the first time, it was the Romans who had the better cavalry, and Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him. The unbeatable general suffered his first and his last major defeat. And just like that, the war was over. After the war, Hannibal actually became a statesman in Carthage. But Rome never forgave him. They never stopped hunting him. He spent the rest of his life as an exile, always on the run. And finally, years later, when he was cornered by Roman soldiers, he chose to die on his own terms. He took poison that he'd apparently carried with him for years, rather than be taken prisoner by his lifelong enemies. So that leads to the big question, right? If he ultimately lost the war, why do we remember him? Why is he considered one of the absolute greatest military minds to have ever lived? What's his real legacy? Well, his influence is just everywhere. The tactic he used at Cannae, that double envelopment, it still required reading at places like West Point and military academies all over the world. He proved that one brilliant mind could take on overwhelming resources and almost win. And maybe his biggest legacy is that he inspired generations of future leaders, including, ironically, Scipio, the very man who finally defeated him. And that actually brings us to one last amazing story. Years after the war was over, Scipio and Hannibal supposedly met one last time. And Scipio, the guy who conquered him, asked Hannibal a question that had clearly been bugging him for a long, long time. Scipio asked him, "Who do you think is the greatest general of all time?" And Hannibal says, "Alexander the Great, then Pyrrhus, and then me, in third place." So Scipio, a little annoyed, asks, "Well, what would you have said if you had beaten me at Zama?" And Hannibal's reply is just pure gold. He says, "Oh, in that case, I would have put myself before Alexander." Even in defeat with just his words, he manages to both flatter his conqueror and declare himself the greatest of all time. It just leaves you wondering, was he right?